All right, so Senator Bernard Sanders has a new book that's just come out called It Is Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism. Now, I haven't actually gotten a chance to read this book yet, but obviously I would agree with the underlying sentiment of it. But he recently did a sit-down interview with Jen Psaki to promote this book, and this interview was pretty revealing for so many different reasons that we're going to get into here. I'm going to show you guys a couple different clips and give you my take as we go through this. But first off, before we get into this, we're talking about Jen Psaki, okay, who now has a show on MSNBC. Her former job was to be a propagandist for the Joe Biden administration, for the Democratic Party, for the White House, and now she has a show on a corporate media outlet, which kind of gives you an insight in terms of how, corrupt some of our mainstream media outlets can be, where you're just straight up hiring somebody as a so-called journalist who just came from the position of being a government propagandist, and that is unambiguously what the job of a White House press secretary is. So in and of itself, the fact that she has this show, I think is kind of hilarious, but let's just go ahead and jump into this. So this first clip, basically, she is pushing back against Bernie Sanders for having a decent focus on class politics, and I guess in her view, she thinks that he kind of overlooked abortion and other, cultural issues over the last couple of years, especially during the midterms. So let's just see how she frames one of these first questions here, and then he's obviously going to push back on it.
You wrote in an op-ed back in October, Senator Sanders, last year, that Democrats shouldn't focus only on abortion in the midterms. That's a mistake. It proved to be quite a winning issue. In fact, the level of backlash to Dobbs really even surprised me, and I've been at this a while too. Did you underestimate the power of this issue and the power it had in motivating voters?
No, Jen, what I said is that abortion should be front and center. The right of women to control their own lives is a fundamental issue, but it cannot be the only issue. And if you recall, during the 2020 campaign, at the end of the campaign, people started talking about workers' rights. People started talking about Social Security and preserving Medicare and health care. So, no, I don't think I was wrong. Bottom line is, of course, we have to continue the fight for women's rights and abortion rights. But you cannot ignore the reality that 60% of the workers in this country are living paycheck to paycheck. We have massive income and wealth inequality. People can't afford childcare. They can't afford health care. And they are struggling. You cannot ignore those issues.
Okay, so a pretty reasonable response there. The question in and of itself was kind of bizarre framing, because even in the little tear sheet that they put up on screen, that was that op-ed that he wrote right before the midterms, right? It even said Democrats shouldn't focus only on abortion. He wasn't saying like Democrats shouldn't talk about abortion. Obviously not. That's not what he was saying in any way, shape, or form. He was just saying you can't just lean on the fact that Republicans are engaging in this attack on women's rights and this attack on abortion rights and just expect that that is going to be enough in and of itself to win the election. Okay, he was talking about all of those other different issues that Democrats should have focused on in a more dramatic way, in my opinion at least, and obviously in his opinion, things like tackling inflation, things like, tackling things like a lack of affordability on healthcare or childcare or a lack of a living wage for millions of people in this country. That's what he was saying. It's like such a reasonable baseline opinion that shouldn't be controversial in any way, shape, or form. But here also just to give you a little bit of an idea in terms of like what people's focus actually was going into the midterm elections. So this is some of the exit polling that we got here from NBC News. You can see here, abortion was definitely a substantial issue in the minds of the American people going into these elections, but that's at 27%. Inflation is at 32%. And guess what? People who found inflation to be the top issue tended to skew towards supporting Republican candidates. That's a problem, okay? It's a problem if you are just going to focus your campaign disproportionately on abortion rights. Again, not saying you shouldn't talk about it or shouldn't have talked about it back then and still to this day, but if inflation is the number one issue in the minds of the American people, then yes, you should be putting a massive portion of your focus during those elections on tackling some of those kitchen table economic issues and describing how you are going to better handle that issue than Republicans. That's the point that he was trying to make, is that you can't ignore this massive blue part over here and just expect that this green part in and of itself is going to win you those elections. Now, as he pointed out there, obviously many candidates did end up leaning slightly more into economic issues, and Democrats had a pretty good showing. It's not that abortion didn't play a role in that. Obviously it did. It was a multitude of different factors, but the idea that you're just going to sit here and get angry at him for saying that Democrats shouldn't only focus on abortion as the only issue within their campaigns, it's just completely ridiculous. So now I want to move ahead to this other clip that we got lined up here. This one is essentially on how democratic failures over the last number of decades kind of led to the rise of Donald Trump, and just a more recent history as working class people tend to skew towards supporting Donald Trump with some of his fake populist rhetoric, basically describing how democratic failures are enabling that kind of rhetoric to be effective amongst a working class base. So let's go ahead and jump to this clip here.
Former President Trump has appealed to working class voters, as have you, over the course of your career quite a bit. And in a recent CNN poll,
Jen, I don't appeal to working class voters. I appeal to voters in general, and all of the issues
you certainly do. You certainly do, Senator.
You can tell that Bernie is getting like super fed up throughout this interview. Now, granted, we're kind of skipping around here, so maybe we're missing a little bit of it, but he clearly is not happy with the interviewing style of Jen Psaki here, and it's honestly hilarious.
Point here, let me get to it. In a recent CNN poll, 58% of Republicans without a four-year college degree said nominating Trump again would give the party its best chance of winning in 2024. And you have warned about not focusing on issues that are important to a range of Americans in the working class. Are Democrats underestimating Trump? Is that something you're concerned about as you're watching?
Of course they're underestimating Trump. But the issue that we should ask ourselves is, how does it happen when you have a pathological liar who is a billionaire who could care less about working class people, ends up with so much working class support? And the reason is that for too many years, the Democratic leadership has turned its back on working people. So you have today a minimum wage which remains at $7.25 an hour. That makes sense? You are the only major country on earth that doesn't guarantee health care to all people as a human right. Talking to you 50 miles away from the Canadian border. They spend one half as much as we do per capita. You guarantee health care to all people. We pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We have corporations who are making it harder for workers to join unions. We have a child care system, which is a total disaster. Do you think we're paying attention to the needs of the working class in this country? Billionaires are doing phenomenally well. It's time we stood up with work for working people and fought for a government and a society that work for all of us. And when you do that, I think people will see the fraudulent nature of somebody like Donald Trump.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, this is something we've obviously been talking about for years now at this point. It seems like it's a lesson that tons of liberals just absolutely refuse to actually learn from. I mean, there's a reason why Hillary Clinton was such a weak candidate against somebody like Donald Trump back in the 2016 election, and a large portion of that is because Hillary Clinton was like the embodiment of the neoliberal status quo maintenance, okay? And so people who have been shafted by that neoliberal capitalist framework for decades, of course they were going to be more susceptible to falling for some of the fake populist economic rhetoric coming from Donald Trump, or even just somebody who they thought would be a shakeup to a completely dysfunctional system. And so you have somebody who's representing the status quo maintenance in Hillary Clinton, somebody who's an absolute wild card in Donald Trump, who also again uses some of that rhetoric about they shipped your jobs overseas and they don't give a shit about working class people, which is absolutely true. Now, does Donald Trump actually want to aggressively solve those problems? No, because as Bernie was pointing out there, he's a selfish, egotistical, billionaire capitalist who doesn't give a single solitary shit about average working class people, right? None of his agenda was actually getting to the underlying core root of the problem as to why he actually ended up winning the election in 2016, which is pretty ironic to some extent, but he's 100% correct, Bernie is, in basically saying that Democrats need to learn the lesson that the way that you defeat somebody like Donald Trump with that fake economic populist rhetoric is by actually delivering on a left-wing economic populist agenda. You provide people with universal health care, you provide them with living wages and just a stable, economic reality for themselves and their families. You make sure they can afford to put a roof over their head and food on the table. It's not that complicated, okay? So that's the best way to push back against far-right populists or against outright fascists in some circumstances. So again, he's 100% correct about that. So now I want to continue here. We have another clip that is lined up. I guess it's going to be the exact next question. At least that's what I have it marked here on my time codes. But she's basically going to ask him about what exactly she thinks Biden has been falling short on so far throughout his administration. So let's go ahead and hear what he's got to say about that.
President Biden said this week he plans to run for re-election, but he is not yet prepared to announce. You have said you're going to support President Biden, but are there places, and maybe you touched on some of them just now, where you've been frustrated that his administration hasn't gone far enough at this point?
Of course they have. Look, you tell me, and let the American people decide why in some cases we're paying 10 times more for prescription drugs as do the people of other nations. Why? And that has to do with the power of the pharmaceutical industry, the fact that they have 1,700 paid lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Has the president been strong enough in telling the drug companies, sorry, stop ripping off the American people while you're enjoying record-breaking profits? No, he is not. We need to raise the minimum wage, in my view, to at least $17 an hour so that working people, low-income people, get a fair shake. Have we heard enough about that? No, we have not. We need, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure that not only do we protect Social Security from the cuts the Republicans wanted, we have to expand it. Half of the elderly people in this country have nothing in the bank as they face retirement. I haven't heard the president talking about that as much as he should. And bottom line, and this is what the book was about that you mentioned earlier, we are moving toward an oligarchic form of society. And I know that that is not comfortable for people to hear, but it's important that we discuss this issue. We have more income and wealth inequality today than we've ever had. We have more concentration of ownership than we have ever had. We have a corrupt political system which allows billionaires through super PACs to buy elections. Those are some of the issues we need to discuss on corporate media. We need to discuss in the United States Congress.
Okay, so, I mean, again, I fucking love Bernie, man. I mean, listen, you can have critiques of him and criticisms of him. Obviously, no politician is like a god or anything, but there is no other senator in the entire country that is able to go and describe these issues in as honest a way as he is able to do right there. And, you know, one of the things that I would kind of semi-disagree with him about, but kind of also agree with him about, is that we are not moving towards an oligarchy. We are already an oligarchy. I mean, we've talked about so many different times on this channel that Princeton study back from 2014, but so many other different pieces of evidence. You don't need just that one economic data point in order to make this argument, that are basically just showing that there is essentially no correlation whatsoever between how much support there is from working class people for any given policy measure and whether or not that's actually going to be passed. And there's almost like a one-to-one correlation, a direct correlation between what the billionaire class, what corporate America wants, and then the likelihood of that being passed into legislation. So that is an oligarchy. I mean, it's certainly not a democracy. It's not a democratic republic or whatever you want to call the United States. It's none of those things. Okay, this is corruption at its finest. So that's kind of something that I would semi disagree with him on. But beyond that, I mean, this is actually the first time that I've seen him bring up a $17 minimum wage. I don't know if he's been focusing on that more recently. I haven't seen that moving past the $15 minimum wage. But yeah, I mean, ever since we had Kyrsten Sinema give her cutesy little thumbs down and reject the $15 minimum wage bill that was coming through the Senate, we basically have to move past that point. I mean, that's no longer going to be enough. And in fact, if you look at previous data points throughout modern American history, essentially since like the Reagan or the Nixon administration, if wages had just kept pace with productivity and inflation, then they would be upwards of like $25 an hour now. So even $17 an hour, you could make an argument it's actually not going to be enough in the long run, certainly. So that's another thing that he was saying there, which is absolutely correct. Yes, we need to obviously move above a goddamn $7.25 an hour minimum wage, which is not a living wage in any county around the United States. And then obviously the other things as well, Biden's shortcomings when it comes to, not only not challenging the members of his own party like Kyrsten Sinema, like Joe Manchin, for eviscerating his entire economic agenda, the Build Back Better agenda, and tearing it into a million pieces and then pissing on it. Not only did Biden not push back against them for doing that, but then you also have issues like with Big Pharma, where it's like, okay, you pass through the bipartisan, bills that he has managed to get through, and you have like some semblance of like, okay, we're going to lower some specific medications for some Americans, like specifically seniors, and we're going to cap certain prices on certain things, and it's like you're just like waffling here, okay? You're doing this complete, middle ground approach where you're not really getting to the root of the problem. What you need to do is either, well, in my ideal world, is just nationalize Big Pharma. It's not an industry that should be driven by the profit motive at all at just a fundamental level. But if you're not going to do that, then at least do what every other developed country around the world does and make these companies negotiate directly with the government. We could have Medicare negotiate every single drug price, or we could just publicly produce drugs and try to flood the market with cheaper generic alternatives to get the prices down that way. I mean, there's so many different things that we could do that Biden has just been obviously falling short in terms of actually tackling those programs. So I'm going to finish off here with basically a clip of Jen Psaki getting mad at Bernie for writing a book about why it's okay to be mad about capitalism and questioning why he's focusing on all of those different various economic issues that he just listed off during this conversation so far, instead of focusing on the culture war issues like abortion and other ones like that. So let's go ahead and hear what she has to say about this.
The title of your book, It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism, really did sit with me. It is a memorable book title, Senator. Of all the things voters are angry about, and there are many, abortion, the lack of progress on gun reform, even Clarence Thomas's questionable relationship with a billionaire. I know how you feel about billionaires. Why should capitalism be at the top of that list? Why was that important to be in the title of that book?
Jen, what's important? Abortion is a huge issue. Social justice is a huge issue. But, sometimes The corporate media forgets about it, and Congress forgets about it. You and I are chatting today. Do you know that there are tens and tens of millions of Americans who cannot afford health care, who are scared to death that if their kid or their parent gets sick, they don't know what's going to happen? There are people working for starvation wages. There are moms who can't afford to send their kids to decent childcare, can't even find a slot. Those are issues of enormous consequence we don't talk about. Now you tell me, you got 3 people on top today who own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. Is that an issue we should be talking about? Does that sound like we have an economy that works for all of us or just the few? Is that an issue worth discussing?
We're talking about it now, Senator, so I'm happy to have you on. I wanted to ask you about President... I did want to ask you...
Okay, so, I mean, honestly, that end part just kind of pissed me off when she's like, oh, well, we're talking about it right now. It's like, Jen, you just spent this entire argument, you just spent this entire interview with this man basically trying to nudge him away from talking about capitalism and away from giving those substantive underlying critiques. The entire conversation surrounding capitalism and why it's justified to be angry about that was forced from Bernie Sanders' angle on this, forcing himself to bring up all of those different things. You weren't asking him questions about healthcare in the United States or living wages in the United States or childcare or any number of those other economic issues he just brought up. That was him leading the conversation in that direction, which is, you know, just absolutely amazing that she would turn around and like condescendingly tell him like, well, I'm having you on right now to talk about those things. Literally just like seconds after she asked the question, why are you talking about capitalism instead of focusing on abortion and gun control issues? And, you know, something that he didn't say there, now his response I think was pretty good. He's listing off all of these different problems, the skyrocketing inequality and, you know, wealth distribution in this country that is just completely absurd. 3 people having as much wealth as the bottom half of that of this country. I mean, that's completely unsustainable economically, politically, and all of those different things, right? I think his response was decent to that. But one thing that he didn't mention is that even when it comes to those social issues or culture war issues, there is an economic reality that is underpinning those as well. Okay, we wouldn't have all of these corrupt Supreme Court justices like she mentioned there, Clarence Thomas. We wouldn't have a lot of these people at the federal level, at the more local level, and at the Supreme Court level with these judges making these decisions to restrict access to abortion and all of these other decisions that they are making without huge financial players backing their careers and leading to their rise. Okay, so you can't even remove capitalism from the arguments surrounding social and cultural issues like abortion, because that is what is driving a large portion of this. Even some of the political pundits, right? Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens. Who do you think these people who are driving a lot of this like anti-trans hysteria and anti-LGBTQ momentum on the right, who do you think is paying these people? Okay, believe it or not, Ben Shapiro, the Daily Wire, all of those people, they are not grassroots funded, okay? They are funded by millionaires and billionaires. So even on those issues, even on like some of the largest culture war issues, especially the gun control debate, where you have huge financial players like the NRA that dump millions of dollars into politicians' campaign coffers, the underlying core root of the problem within this country on essentially every single issue that you want to talk about is capitalism. It is capitalism as a structure, as an economic system, and it is also the reality that politically in this country, we have effectively legalized corruption and bribery, okay? We have massive concentration of ownership, massive concentration of wealth, and we have a billionaire class, we have corporate America that are able to buy off our political system. That's the underlying problem with all of these different issues, so it's fucking deranged that you would sit there and talk to somebody who has been speaking about these issues for his entire fucking life and talk to him as if he doesn't understand the reality of what needs to be done in this country. I mean, again, obviously it's hilarious just at a fundamental level that Jen Psaki came from being a White House propagandist to now being on MSNBC with her own show, but you can see the result because clearly she is nothing but a status quo defender and doesn't want to actually have any underlying conversations about the root of the problems in this country, and certainly does not want to challenge the status quo, which is supposed to be the entire job of a journalist. Your whole job is supposed to be to challenge the most powerful institutions and people in this country, and you are utterly failing.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying